I have the honor of interviewing Rachel Fulton Brown, Associate Professor of History at the University of Chicago. Professor Fulton Brown's academic work focuses on medieval religious thought and practice, as well as the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. She has written 2 books, From Judgment to Passion, Devotion to Christ and the Virgin Mary, 800 to 1200, and Mary and the Art of Prayer, The Hours of the Virgin in Medieval Christian Life and Thought, both published by the Columbia University Press. Most recently, she has edited and contributed to the composition of 2 works of poetry. Centrism Games is a biting political satire that has proven to hold accurate predictions, and Aurora Borealis is a delightful children's book which introduces Christian concepts to children through adventurous bears and rich illustrations. Both are available online at dragoncommonroom.com. Make sure to look out for her 3rd work of poetry, Draco Alchemicus, as she and her crew of craftsmen delve into the realm of science fiction and horror. If you would like more of the professor's insights, she blogs at fencingbear@prayer.blogspot.com. Her posts on Milo Yiannopoulos have been compiled into the Milo Chronicles, Devotions 2016 to 2019, which recount their unlucky friendship and the controversies that have grown up from their vigorous defense of free speech on campus. She also publishes lectures on J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings on Unauthorized TV's Forge of Tolkien. I hope you enjoy our conversation on the Virgin Mary, Tolkien, and the devotion to the United States.
Writing up an article, right?
We were planning on doing an interview to show it, and then potentially write an article that goes more in depth. So I'd obviously read more of the work. Okay.
All right. So we're doing this now. Okay.
Oh.
So no, that's fine. That's fine. I would have dressed up more. So in medieval understanding, art is the skill or the practice that you require to be able to do something. And I'm taking this actually from a oral exam that we just did in the dip school with Father Gabriel Toretta, who is thinking about art in the Carolingian period. And one of his papers he did for me, and he was talking specifically about this problem of defining what the Latin term art means in the period. And he gave what I thought was just a lovely description of this problem of, we think in modernity primarily of art as the object that's made, right? It's like either, the musical composition or the painting or the building or something like that. But in the medieval understanding, that's what I was really pointing to with the art of prayer. It's the practice that you need in order to make that beautiful thing, right? The ornament. And Father Gabriel did a nice job of showing it's like what we think of in the modern period as a work of art is, we just call it art. We left out that work part. They would think of more of as an ornament or a beautification or something like that. They used words that talk about that. Sorry, there's cooking going on. There's art of cooking going on in the background. So when I'm talking about the art of prayer, it's the training in the texts, in the disposition, in the sort of habit that would enable you to pray, right? And then you should ask what prayer is as well, which is a complicated problem because in the present, we didn't think of prayer, thanks to really the 19th century, more sort of Protestant evangelical in the proper older sense of evangelical, right? The kind of camp meeting revival sort of stuff that the Presbyterians start and the Baptists and Methodists pick up on, that prayer in that 19th century, it's not only American, but very American context. It's very enthusiastic and affective, right? You sort of are inspired in the moment to praise God. And so it's hard for those of us who think of prayer as more effective if it's unscripted to appreciate the kind of scripting that medieval Christians were expecting from the most simple script of Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum, right? The Hail Mary, to the full script, as it were, in that lay people would want to learn, which was the Hours of the Virgin, which is what the book is about, the sort of the art of praying that script and what kind of mental discipline it would take, what kind of understanding it would take, and what kind of practice it would take. Now, the practice part, that's hard for us as modern readers to get to, particularly scholars, because we're not scholars, and particularly you guys at the University of Chicago who love theory, right? It's like, oh, that's fine in practice. How is it in theory? But that means, I mean, there's certain things that if you only do the theory on, as it were, you never get the theory. You never get what the actual experience was like. And theoria, in fact, if you read your Gadamer, Truth and Method, you recognize is a kind of participatory problem, that you don't just sort of study a thought and contemplate it, but the contemplation is itself bound up in the practice. And so all of that is the sort of exercise that Marrying the Art of Prayer, my book, is trying to get you to appreciate and possibly to participate in. I have, you may know, thanks to the blog and other things, an audience outside of academia, and I regularly get letters from people now saying they have, because of Marrying the Art of Prayer, started praying the hours of the Virgin, which I take as an amazing compliment and the best book review I can get.
Yeah. A book about practice that inspires practice.
Right, exactly. So as an academic book, it's a little unusual because it's trying to take you, as potentially the academic reader, into that practice and appreciate the sort of complexity of training that it took to be in that practice. It's not an academic book, and then it doesn't actually theorize within the book that much. I mean, I do a little bit, but the theorization of how the practice worked is in a series of articles that I did in sort of the over the decade or so that it took me to write the book. Okay. So if you want the theory, it's in the articles.
And well, in your acknowledgments, you wrote about how you were thankful for the fellowship that helped you study behavioral and cognitive psychology. So how did that help you kind of both perceive and understand the psychology of people who are praying the hours, and then how did that help you to try and convey that to your audience?
So that becomes, in writing, actually a deep rhetorical problem, right? And I'd say as writing, learning what to write was one thing, right? And I did, the blog actually came out of that it's Fencing Bear at Prayer, and it's meant to be this meditation and cry of frustration over how hard it was to train myself in in the mental discipline, the psychological, spiritual, emotional discipline to fence, right? And I actually started fencing around the time I started working on Marrying the Art of Prayer, right? It was, and in actually the same year I was doing that Mellon Fellowship, that psychology training. I was interested in the metaphor of fighting, the sort of battle metaphors that are like baked into monastic discipline, right? And they're there partly because it's in the Psalms, it's in the primary text that the prayers are based on. But there's also this sense that monastic training is it's a training in a spiritual battle, right? And they're 10th century, particularly 10th century prayers that make it clear that the monks and nuns are expected to be battling the demons, on behalf of the community, right? And so they have this very sort of military, agonic, if you say the Greek, agonistic, understanding of what prayer is, right? It's battling these spiritual forces. And that goes back to the early Desert Fathers as well, because they sort of go out into the desert to battle the demons, right? And St. Anthony is their Renaissance pictures of St. Anthony famously being attacked by all the different crazy demons. So I did the Mellon program because I was interested in that training, sort of was interested in figuring out how you study that kind of cognitive training. What I found in the Mellon program was that they're not actually doing that in psychology, right? At least not my colleagues that I did courses with here. Although some of them, Howard Nussbaum, since I did his linguistics course, has gone on to do a really important program in wisdom, right? He has sort of training in wisdom. So they're interested in practice, but there were ways in which, for example, the course in cognitive psychology I did was talking a lot about things that we in medieval studies were talking about, like training and memory and so forth. But it was almost, throughout as if they were rediscovering things that were already there in the monastic tradition. So I think I made myself a little bit of a gadfly in the courses. Got me going. We're talking about, like, I mean, the endocrine system stuff was very interesting in Martha McClintock's course. You probably know her studies from her Bryn Mawr study of women cycling together in their dorm rooms in terms of their menstrual cycles. And so Professor McClintock has done a lot of work on pheromones and hormones and things like that. And so when I had to do a presentation for that, I brought in Hildegard Bingen's discussion of the temperamental differences thanks to the humors. Like, they're metaphors, right? They're models that make sense in both, medieval terms and, really interestingly, in our terms. And so I left the Mellon year thinking, okay, what I need to do is really pay better attention to what I'm finding in the medieval texts. And it became a rhetorical challenge, I said, because, like, if you're trying to explain an experience that you are yourself training in, like fencing or prayer, how do you do it for the reader, right? Because if you're fencing, you have to be fencing, right? And even for someone who's learning to do that physical thing, the descriptions, the words, the actual words that you use to say, okay, well, when you're in the bout, you need to be watching for the opening. I can do it, right? I'll start moving to do it, right? Because my body knows how to do it now. But my intellect, that's what the blog is about, like how stupid I felt because I could put into words the need to, like, don't let your ego get in the way. And I'm like, how do you do that? But really, how do you do that? Okay, fine. I don't put your ego in the way. And I did do a course back in 2006 on spiritual exercises where we sort of talk through some of these problems. And one of the good selections I used was something on William James on attention that I had learned from my psychology classes, where he's talking about, or maybe, I mean, we talked about this now. I don't remember whether it was James himself you're talking about it. We're saying if you have the word for what it is that you're aiming for in your attention, it doesn't magically make it possible that you know what you're talking about. But on the other hand, once you've had that experience, having the word interestingly anchors you to knowing that was what you're aiming at, right? So all of, for example, in fencing, one of the, the principal things you have to learn is patience and sort of getting yourself in the moment, like truly, completely in the moment of watching your opponent moving back and forth and, because you need to just take it one touch at a time. Because if you get on the strip and you're worried about, I need to make 5 touches, right? Basically, the other person's going to hit you 5 times and you're done. Right? So you have to learn this feeling of patience to wait and tell yourself one touch at a time, use the whole 3 minutes of the bout, do this, do that. And those cues can be anchors, but until you've actually practiced it yourself, you don't know what those cues mean, right? And so there's this interesting kind of feedback between the verbal instruction and the actual doing. And I realized when I'm writing my book, I'm trying to give you cues like a fencing coach for something you may or may not have ever practiced. How do I get you inside? Well, the book starts with imagine yourself, right? And that throws off all sorts of academic readers because like, I don't want to do that, which is which is interesting. It's like, well, what do you want to do, right? If you're a scholar of devotion or religion or, practices of any kind, art, beauty, right? What sort of relationship are you going to have to the object of your study? And that, I sort of, again, the more you do have to do it before you realize the need for the theorizing.
That reminded me also of the image that you used, both the story you brought up in Tolkien Medieval and Modern, and then you mentioned very early on in Mary and the Art of Prayer, which is C.S. Lewis's story about looking at someone that's looking up a skylight through a beam of light. How does the person that's looking up at the sun through the skylight explain the sun to someone outside? It's how do you explain it without just sounding like you're making stuff up?
Exactly, because I'm glad you remembered that, because it's the best short version of the problem that I know of, right? And it's obviously, it takes a physical metaphor, right? He's in the tool shed, he sees the light streaming through the crack in the door, and from outside of that sunbeam, he just sees the beam, right? And he sees, you know, the the motes and the dust but once he steps into it, he says, I can't see the beam anymore because all I see is the object, the sun that I'm looking at. And that, I use that in Marrying the Art of Prayer at the beginning, right? To say, this is the problem that we have as scholars looking at devotion, right? If you're looking at someone practicing a devotion, what you see is nonsense, right? You see somebody, you know, making particular physical gestures, or, you know, doing the ordinary things like lighting candles or burning incense, or you see them looking at a painting or something like that, but you don't see what they see. And how, I mean, and you know, Lewis is pointing out, he's writing in the 40s, right? He's saying the problem we have, he's saying in the 40s, right, but we still have it now, is that the social scientists, the anthropologists, psychologists, I can't remember whichever other ones he said, but like anthropologists and psychologists are claiming that their explanation from the psychological perspective or from the cultural comparative perspective or something is sufficient to understand what that experience is, right? And so, you know, Lewis is making a plea for, in fact, multiple modes of engagement with the objects of our study, so that, and anthropologically, well, I mean, it's interesting because the anthropologists have theorized and worried about this a lot. What if you go native and you're basically so, you know, thoroughly immersed in the culture or the faith that you're studying, you just see things as they do? Well, then how can you talk to the people who are just looking at you now? You're standing in the beam going, right? And your academic colleagues are going, oh, you've gone nuts now. Right. So, but the problem, I mean, the problem is if you then step back outside of the beam and start talking to the people who are looking at you, the people who are still within the beam will feel like you've betrayed them quite powerfully, right? Because we thought you were one of us. We thought you could see what we showed you, right? We thought you learned that this is reality, right? And this is fundamentally an unsolvable problem. I argue as a Christian. I mean, it's an unsolvable problem for academics, right? Because every single time you claim that the only version of reality is the one that you're arguing within, and, you know, and you exclude the possibility that faith is a true one, you are making an epistemological claim that, you know, those of us with faith would not think is supportable. But I mean, Lewis is pretty careful in the essay. He's saying that those who are looking from within the beam of anthropology or psychology are also themselves in a beam, right? It's like, and what he's trying to show you is that you have a framing understanding. And what I say is, you know, someone who studies conversion and Christianity and so forth, is that's exactly the way Augustine in his On Christian Doctrine describes the problem of conversion, that you're finding yourself within the story that the catechist is saying, here you are, right? Here's, you know, the history of reality from creation to revelation, and we're in the history of the church, and here you're part of it, and this is the story you're in, right? And Tolkien does that. You know, remember that from the course, that Tolkien does that with Sam and Frodo, when Sam realizes we're in the same story as, you know, Arundel with his starlight, and Galadriel gave us some of that light. And so you are in that moment recognizing reality, right? But again, the people from outside are going to look at you and say, oh, you've gone nuts. And that you've gone nuts it's a very interesting problem. It's like, what do those of us who can see the sun say?
More of the specific content of Marrying the Art of Prayer. One of the things that really interested me is, and I'm still in this part of the book, but I've gotten fairly deep into it, is the discussion of the temple tradition and the various tensions within the Old Testament regarding the presence of Mary. I guess we should probably start off explaining kind of briefly how medieval Catholics would read the Hours of the Virgin. How do they perceive of Mary as permeating the Bible?
Well, the same way they perceive Christ, right? And that's, I mean, the temple tradition, this thing is a sort of Ouroboros, and the sort of problem of if you see, medieval Christians read Mary everywhere in Scripture, right? And in the 12th century particularly, we start getting vast catalogs of how all of these different images represent her in the scriptures. I mean, very particularly things like the ark and the temple and the throne of Solomon, but also things like the cloud that went before the Israelites in the desert, or the mountain of Zion, on which the holy city sits, the city itself. I mean, there's that one of the texts that I talk about in Mary and the Art of Prayer, Richard of Saint Laurent, De Laudibus Beata Maria Virginis Libri Duodecim, is 12 books of images of Mary taken from all of Scripture, right? So the problem that I came to, and this is why I say it's a sort of Ouroboros, that I was reading these 12th and 13th century texts and saying, they see Mary everywhere, vast catalogs, what they end up calling rosaries, right? They're originally basically lists of her names. And particularly the names that they find, I mean, they're everywhere in Scripture, but they're finding them particularly in the Psalms, because the Psalms, as I said a little bit earlier, are the basis for the divine office, right? They're the basic texts that monks and nuns are praying. And in the liturgy, there are special feasts for Mary that they're recognizing her role in salvation. So there are things like her purification in the temple, which is February 2nd, aka Groundhog Day, Candlemas, March 25th, which is the fall of Baradur. No, wait, which is Lady Day, which is the Annunciation, when Gabriel comes to her and says, "You're going to be the mother of the Son of the Most High." Her Assumption, which is the day on which she is taken up in body and soul into heaven to reign with Christ. So a good part of medieval devotion depends on the image that she's there in heaven already, right? So she's seated with Christ in heaven. And then September 8th, which is her, or 9th, why don't I know that one? Because December 8th is her conception. Okay, I'm embarrassed. I should know my dates. The September one is her nativity, and that the conception becomes a feast is also a big debate, right? So there are these various feasts. Most of them, in fact, all of those, originate in the Eastern Orthodox Church, and they come to the Latin Roman Church in the 7th and 8th centuries, when there's a series of popes that are from Syria and Greece, and they bring these observances with them to the West. The Carolingians pick them up, but then when the Carolingians pick them up, they are sort of nervous of some of the story claims that are in those feast days. So, for example, not so much conception, because that becomes a debate in the 12th century, but the Carolingians in particular, these are the Charlemagne and his family, right? Charlemagne is big on reforming the liturgy, and they write lots of books down. And so the earliest texts that we have of the chants that go with the liturgy come from that period, the 9th century. The Carolingians are particularly worried that the stories about what happened to Mary after she dies aren't scriptural, right? They're technically apocrypha, or legendary or something like that. You say they aren't part of the canon of the liturgy, the text that you use in the liturgy usually. And so what do you do with the story that she is, when she died, the apostles took her body to the tomb, and then 3 days later, Jesus shows up with a company of angels and takes her body, not just her soul, but her body with him back into heaven, right? And the Carolingian liturgists are nervous about putting that text itself into their offices, into the things that they read on the feast days. So instead, they focus on the Song of Songs. I'm getting to the answer to your question. And the way they use the Song of Songs is as framing texts for the Psalms that they use on her feast days, because the liturgy is always based on the Psalms, right? The Psalms are the book of the temple songs that's in the Old Testament. And it's sort of confusing to modern Christians, because you may or may not realize, because we're so used to having all of our other hymns and things like that, that it's the Psalms that are the core of the church's singing. And in the Middle Ages, when you had an office for a feast day, you'd have to have Psalms that were chosen specially to go with that feast, right? And from the Carolingian period, the selection of Psalms that show up in the Marian feast is very, very stable, right? It's the ones that become the center of her actual the hours, right? The repertoire of texts that are used to like frame those Psalms, the antiphons, is much more fluid, right? It's like they that's one of the interesting things about the Office of the Virgin. It's like so many different versions of it. They're like hundreds, literally hundreds. Every local place would have its own version. Although there's some big ones like the use of Rome or the use of Sarum or the use of York that are in sort of larger regions. But
you in your book,
so
there's like Rouen and Chartres, which are like what, a couple dozen miles away.
right there, I mean, it's
They
like
would
it's
have
particularly northern France. Like every single town seems to have put together its own set of texts, and so they're fluid but stable in different ways. And that was one of the challenges in writing the book. It's like, which version am I talking about? Well, it's sort of all of them, but the exegesis I give is just the Roman one. And the way the texts go together in the liturgy is you have an introductory verse that then you say before the psalm, then you say the psalm, and then you say the introductory verse again, right? So antiphon and psalm. And so it's a lovely sort of musical and textual conceit, as it were, that the antiphons change with the feast days, and the psalms are obviously, there's only under 150 of them, right? So they're more stable. Only, well, there are 150 of them, and then the 9 that are used regularly for the Marian feast are very, very stable, right? They're always the ones that appear in her feast days, and so you can see which psalms the medieval liturgists think are most associated with her. And what's interesting about those psalms is, except for Psalm 44, and I'm going to give them in the Septuagint numbering, so it's always a little off if you're using the Masoretic numbering. In Psalm 44, it's the description of the bride, the marriage of the king with his mother standing beside his throne. And that's a very particular image from the temple tradition, that the mother of the king is the sort of one who stands by his throne. And you can see that is clearly what Mary becomes, right? She's sitting or standing beside Christ. But the others are all really praising God, right? Or praising his protection of her. I mean, my favorite is 86:3, where glorious things are said of you, O city of God, right? It's recognizing her as the city of God, and glorious things are said of you. So I think I can do this from memory, sort of. If you were a student at Eton College in the 15th century, you could say the Hours of the Virgin, Matins of the Virgin by memory while you were making your bed. So I'm like I'm below like a college student, high school student, I guess, in medieval terms. But Psalm 45 talks about making your habitation in her, and Psalm 18 talks about the sun placing, you placed your tabernacle in the sun, kind of thing. So there's this incredible rich imagery that's in the Psalms that are chosen to be in her feasts. And then the framing texts that go with them, many of them were drawn from the Song of Songs. So it's a love song. So these are, how beautiful she is, and how we sing the text of the drama before your bed, and things like that. That's just one of the antiphons, but it evokes the Song of Songs. And my problem as a medieval historian, knowing this liturgy, was where did all this come from, right? And this is getting you to the temple tradition problem. It's like, well, do they just like pick them at random because they kind of fit? Exactly how do they fit? My first book is about how the Song of Songs made sense to them, because they write by the 12th century, start saying, why are we singing all these texts about her when they don't seem to have anything to do about her? And they make the Song of Songs into this drama, this conversation between Christ and Mary. But that still doesn't explain why the Carolingians use the Song of Songs. Well, I argued that they're doing it because it fits this sort of narrative, right? But the Carolingians and the Roman Church, in their time, the 8th, 9th century, 7th, 8th, 9th century, it's a transition period, get these feasts, as I said, from the East, which then pushes the question of where does it come from back in another place, right? It's like, well, okay, so they in fact are using the text that you can see in the Byzantine sermons. Well, that's fine. Why do the Byzantine sermons have these images, right? And then I got into massive trouble because
it's a bit more Byzantine.
Right, no, but I was asked to do a review of a book on the Byzantine cult of Mary, and I found Margaret Barker's work in that book on the temple tradition, and I went, oh my goodness. Barker is trying to show that this imagery is actually closely associated with the figure she calls the Lady of the Temple from before the Christianity, right? So that in the sort of long argument, just as, Jesus said, I came to fulfill the law, not um, abolish it. The early Christians tended to insist that they were restoring the temple, which is really difficult if you think of what they were restoring as what we now know as Rabbinic Judaism, which it wasn't, because Rabbinic Judaism is like Christianity, a development out of the first century, right? It's like the rupture happens around Jesus, in fact, and those who recognize Jesus as fulfilling the temple tradition become Christians, and those who say no, he isn't, become rabbinic Jews, right? And so the temple tradition, and this Barker, it's like the Orthodox tend to love her, right? Because she's so deeply steeped in their understanding of how the Christian worship is in fact a fulfillment of the temple liturgy. And in that liturgy, the lady is very, very prominent. She's wisdom. She's this one who opens the eyes. She has this role, as for example in Psalm 44, of standing beside the throne of the king. The king is understood as anointed as the sun, which then has some very interesting parallels with other Near Eastern monarchies, right? He's sort of the king is this kind of god king figure. What do you do with that? And that therefore, I mean, this is the single most controversial thing I say in the book. It's like, therefore, when the Christians claim that they were restoring an older tradition, maybe they weren't kidding, right? But then the problem becomes, this is my academic reviewers say, well, how could the 13th century know what was happening in Solomon's temple? I'm like, well, they didn't know it. They just, what they thought they were doing was carrying on a tradition. And it's like, how do you test if a tradition has actually been handed down for that long? Because the term, the descriptors have changed. And in the footnotes to Marrying the Art of Prayer, the places where all of these ruptures potentially take place, they're field ruptures in the historiography. I've called dragons, right? Because they're the the sort of places where the dragon eats you, and you either believe that there's this continuity from the ancient temple to Christianity, or you don't. You either believe that there's a continuity from what happens in the early church through the Council of Ephesus, when Mary's recognized as Theotokos. You either believe that there's a continuity from the Eastern Orthodox cult of the Virgin to the West. I mean, that one's usually people accept, but there's a big debate within the Byzantine field right now on whether there's actually a cult of Mary before around the 9th or 10th century, which would be after the feast came to the, so for me, it's an interesting test of the willingness that we have as scholars to see something actually in continuity versus the kinds of narratives that we tend, interestingly, in the scholarship to be more comfortable with, which posit radical ruptures, because I think they make us comfortable as scholars about where we start and stop the story. Vulgate uses the Septuagint numbering of Psalms, which matters a lot because the Greek church uses the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the 2nd, 3rd century BC translation of the Hebrew, right? And it's in fact the Greek that the authors of the New Testament would have known, right? So the actually oldest tradition that we have in manuscript form, and the Dead Sea Scrolls have confirmed this, is the one that the Septuagint represents, right? And the Septuagint, as modern Septuagint scholars now are starting to be able to say, based on the deep study they've done of things like the Dead Sea Scrolls, fits with what the Christians claim the scripture said, right? So I mean, there's a textual history that's highly contestable, and I mean, in the sense of people get contested a lot, but it fits with a claim that the Christians make, that they say Jesus said, I'm restoring the law, I'm restoring the way we're supposed to live, and the Hebrews, the letter to the Hebrews shows the way in which Jesus is the great high priest carrying the sacrifices, right? So it is a restoration of the temple rather than a novelty.
I think you also talked, I think Barker makes the argument that there's a tension or a conflict between certain authors of the Bible or the Old Testament, like specifically the Deuteronomists and the prophets, and then you go through some of that. So I was actually curious about, I think it was the 2nd Kings, the burning of the Asherah and the expulsion of Baal, because I was looking at then some of the different translations, And I was confused if you or Barker were arguing that there was the Lady of the Temple and Baal in the worship, the cult of Baal, or if the Lady of the Temple had been sort of slandered as Baal and then the various Phoenician deities that are kind of polluting the temple.
Yeah, and then that's why I say even with the anointing of the king and his becoming godlike, I mean, that's in Psalm 2, right? That's an anointing psalm, and it's, you have become my son. What does that mean, right? What does that text mean? And one of my favorite studies other than Barker is Mowinkle's study of the Psalms in Israel's worship, and it's a sort of interesting text to read because I used it at the beginning of the Psalms course that I taught a few years ago. He finds these harvest rituals and these divine kings and things like that in the Psalms. And he was criticized in his own day, mid-50s, I guess, 20th century, for making, this worship sound too pagan. and I'm like, well, to me, it sounds medieval and liturgical, right? It's like a lot of the things that he was, quote, finding fit with the later use of those psalms in the medieval liturgy. So your mileage may vary. I think a good deal depends. This is why it's like, this is, to me, I'm throwing my hat in the ring and saying, what if, right? Could it be that in fact, when you're looking at Christianity and these claims of the incarnate God and the significance of his mother, because what I always say when people say, well, Mary's not that important in Christianity, and by the way, you shouldn't be worshiping her, I'm like, why is she in the Gospels? Right? There is, why? It's like they're sort of like, oh, well, yeah, you wouldn't need a birth story. And I'm like, why? Why do you need a birth story? Exactly. Oh, well, it matches things from the Old Testament. Well, right. Why do you need a story about the mom at all? And that, the role that the evangelists give her should be our first clue that things are stranger than we think. Right. And particularly, well, there's a new book that was just reviewed in First Things. I'm sorry, I don't remember the author, but talking about the Gospel of John. And Barker has done a deep study of the Gospel of John, and she finds all of these this temple imagery in the Gospel. This new book on the Gospel of John is saying, in that book it says Jesus gave Mary to John to go live with her. She must have lived with him for a while. I bet she talked to him, right? And though it's the Gospel of John that we get, for example, the story of the marriage of Cana, and you realize that's Jesus's first public miracle, and she nudges him to do it, right? It's like you could say he talks back to her and says, "Oh, well, woman, what does that have to do with me?" When she says they have no wine, but he gives them, and she says, "Do whatever he tells you," and he changes the water into wine, right? So that there are ways in which, even in the Gospels, you have some pretty curious emphases on her. Mary is Mary gives us, you would say, literally the first Christian hymn, which is the Magnificat, right? Which when Elizabeth greets her and she sings, to the Lord, thinks, about the baby that she's carrying. So what is the Asherah? What kind of worship was actually practiced in Solomon's temple? I mean, I've actually talked about this a lot in some different videos I've done over the last few months. I mean, one, I'm doing these Tolkien videos, and I'm talking about the way he's playing off of things like the Enoch stories of what happens when the angels who become fallen angels, actually the sons of God, enter in and have intercourse with the daughters of men, and they have giants, right? That is pretty persuasively describing some pagan practices, temple practices, right? That you'd have the either prostitutes or some other kind of temple women who have sex with characters that are wearing masks that are the sons of God, actual demons, who knows, right? And they give birth to the giants. That Enoch refers to that in the book of Enoch, talking about how these angels bring things like all of the arts and crafts of metallurgy and cosmetics and herbal lore. They tell the women that they're sleeping with the mysteries of the plants and so forth. And Tolkien uses this in his creation story when it's Melkor in his creature, in his characters, right? So that, and Enoch is one of the texts that's used in, or is known to the authors of the New Testament. For example, Jude quotes it from it. There's a lot of back mythology that modern Christians, and I think modern Jews, although Peter Schaeffer, if you really want to know the deep sort of potential in these stories, Peter Schaeffer just did a book on the two gods in ancient Israel.
And that's El and
it's more, he footnote, I think that's the title of the book. It's Peter Schaeffer. He also did Jesus in the Talmud. So there's some interesting stuff there, but he has a footnote about Barker saying she makes some really insightful comments, and other stuff she says is just really hard to take, right? But the thing is, the stuff he's talking about that is in the book of Enoch, that's in these other texts, she says it parallels exactly with what she shows about, the tradition of the great angel of Israel, and the way in which, in fact, Yahweh as the Lord is the angel who's given dominion over Israel, right? And in Deuteronomy, and that's, you talked about the differences in the Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is one of those texts that has some significant changes from the Septuagint, and one of them is in this sort of description of the council of the gods, right? The angels, the other angels, the 72 nations, and Israel, the Lord of Israel is placed over those other nations. What are those other nations? Exactly which angels are those, right? It's like the more closely you read the Old Testament, you realize there's a lot of other stories that are simply assumed that we know in order to get to the sort of core thing, which is saying, one, Israel is not worshiping Yahweh in the way that it's supposed to, and it's going to be punished if it doesn't do so. And, the prophecies that say, look, the Messiah will come, and the Christians say, look, he's fulfilled the prophecies. You don't get like the Gospel of Matthew saying, look, over and over again, Jesus fulfills the prophecies, unless they actually care that he fulfilled those prophecies, right? So the primary difference between medieval and modern Christianity is medieval Christians took these interconnections with the Old Testament very, very seriously, like reading the Song of Songs as a dialogue between Christ and Mary. They understand it as a single text, like a single problem of story, right? And finding the images in the Old Testament and the fulfillment in the New.
I want to talk about the various titles of Virgin Mary, because you've mentioned the various wood, and she's also, as you pointed out in the book, called the Tree of Life, the Cedar of Lebanon. So there's a ton of tree and plant metaphor around the Virgin Mary, which I think Barker also relates to the Asherah. And then there's also the problem of how does God become incarnate in the world, which is something else I want to talk about. And then I think I'll go with, you were just talking about how...
let me talk about trees, but go ahead, ask this one.
We'll get to that. But okay. You were talking about how we seem to have lost a lot of the tradition that provides a lot of the structure around some of the stuff that happens in the Old Testament, which then also reminded me of the fact that you seem to argue throughout the book that the Protestant Reformation stripped a lot of the structure that would have helped us to have understood how Mary was seen throughout the Bible. I think Jordan Peterson has talked about how in Genesis, it makes it very clear that both man and woman are made in the image of God, not just man, as a lot of feminist scholars would argue that Christianity is a patriarchal religion. And so
well, it is, but not the way they mean.
Yeah. So. But it seemed to me that reading all this stuff about Mary, it was like, well, this is a feminine aspect of God that has just been stripped from the text. So,
yes, so there's two ways. I mean, one, they're like you mentioned Jordan Peterson, but they're guys out there in the internet world that insist that Christianity is too feminine, right? And they're not wrong, in the sense that Christianity. This is one of my stronger sort of civilization arguments. Christianity, particularly in the Middle Ages, is training men in the proper service of women. For goodness sake, right? It's like in medieval terms, there's the big debate over chivalry, right? And whether it's a good or bad thing. Well, it's bad if you're using it just for status and to give yourself dinner parties, which happens in the later Middle Ages, right? We did the medieval England class, and you remember when Edward is trying to make himself be King Arthur, and all the late medieval orders of like the Garter and things like that. Yeah, that chivalry is costume, right? That's LARPing. But in the earlier centuries, when you start telling miracle stories of how, the benefits you get from serving Mary, and serving Mary in those stories tends to be saying her hours, right? Devoting yourself to praying to her, that you get a model for, in fact, the way men should behave appropriately towards women, which is, and you could say, okay, that's bad because you put him up on a pedestal. Milo was talking about this recently. It's bad. You put him up on a pedestal and then, you simp, right? Yeah, I know the words you kids use, and and that's considered bad, right? It's like, well, yes, but the thing is, you're supposed to serve her and become stronger in virtue, which is one of the things that I've been trying to write about. So it's interesting that from the feminist perspective, Christianity is too patriarchal. From the, I don't know, what's the opposite? What's the opposite of feminist?
Patriarchal.
No, because patriarchal is good. It's your father taking care of you, right? And giving you proper protection, and being a good, Joseph, right? Being someone who takes care of the family and provides for it and such, right? That the opposite, it sees it as overly feminine, right? Well, it's like if you, as G.K. Chesterton would say, if you got both sides telling you you're completely wrong, maybe there's something in it. And okay, so which was your question?
I was commenting on how the Protestant Reformation seems, by attacking the cult of Mary, or the veneration of Mary, as a fetishism, is kind of stripping the feminine aspect of God. That seems to be an important part of the first story.
Yes. So the Protestants get rid of her because they don't trust the Septuagint. And so they don't, and so they don't include the text. I mean, the trees are important there, right? They don't include the wisdom texts that are in the Septuagint, like Ecclesiasticus 24, which is where all those trees come from. And that means they lose, as I see it, her queenly aspect, right? They get too anxious about worshiping the creature, which she is a creature and she's the container for God. It's like, you might as well worship the temple rather than God. No, you worship her as the place in which God became present in the world. So, she's the quintessential temple. She's the model for the Solomonic temple, or the throne, or the ark, because she is the physical place in which God manifests, right? The Protestants lose that and focus more on her as a human being, which she is, but she's also the place where God became present. And if you claim that the womb in which God became incarnate is just like every other womb and not special, how strongly are you actually believing in Christ's divinity? Which is one of the things that happens in Protestantism over the course of the 19th century, that they get very focused on the historical Jesus, and therefore also the historical Mary, and lose their understanding of the Trinity, which is interesting, right? Because they really lose the mystery of, what are you saying that God became incarnate? How? What does that mean? What's the relationship between the Word and the Father, right? But the problem is, it's again, it's like the opposite side too. That's the modern Catholic understanding of Mary, to my mind, becomes much too sort of ethereal, right? It's like literally the opposite. I mean, one, with the 1854 Declaration of the Immaculate Conception, she's depicted as she was seen on the miraculous medal, right? Just as the woman with the beams of this rings that she has, right, that are streaming light. And that image is not, it's not really a very good medieval image, because in the medieval images, she always has him, right? You
always
need
has
to
Christ on his lap, on her lap.
she's always in association with Christ, unless it's the Annunciation, and then she's in association with there because it's happening at that moment. So that the modern images of her, I think I mean, it's like, this is very largely why I started my scholarship on Mary in the beginning, in the 80s, when you had the feminist critique of Mary, but you also had a Catholic evacuation of her power, which the more I read about Vatican II, the more I understand some of the debates that went on there. But the most significant for Mary was that instead of having a constitution on her specifically, they put her in Lumen Gentium, right? So she's a subcategory to the problem of the church, which means she's sort of part of the hierarchy, but not really the mystery that she is, if you understand her as the temple. And from my perspective, therefore, as medievalists, both get it wrong, right? And the Orthodox, I don't know, I know from the online debates, all of these are like, they're cartoons for everybody, right? And the ortho bros are going to insist, no, we got Mary right. And I'm like, well, you do, but the sort of incarnational symbolism that the West develops in the Middle Ages is also, I think, an appropriate part of that tradition. So I'm trying to get them to pay attention to it. Which just means, you know, it's like we have this fractured image of her, I think, in modernity.
Well, that also reminded me, you comment how Mary was the only, I think you said the only one in the 3 days between Christ's death and then resurrection that maintained faith and never wavered. And so, I mean, just it's kind of ironic for Vatican II to make Mary just a part of the church when it would seem that she is the church. She was the first member, the only person that never wavered on earth. If ever, even the disciples and everyone else were willing to doubt, and she wasn't, well, I guess that would be an argument that that's the wisdom of wisdom coming through her.
I like that. I mean, the thing is that, and this is why Barker's argument of her as wisdom is persuasive to me, right? That but this is, you know, it's complicated because Christ is also called the wisdom of God, right? It's like, well, how can it be both? And Richard of Saint Laurent, one of the ones I talk about in my book, acknowledges this and then says, well, they're kind of both, right? She's the most perfect mirror of Christ. And in that sense, you know, Dante has her as that. Her face is the face that's most like Christ, but she is, talking about how we are made in the image and likeness of God. She is the one made and, you know, preserved, if you know, accept the idea of the Immaculate Conception, right? That she has never sinned ever, so she's the perfect reflection of our Maker. And in that, she's a model for us because she's perfect in her relationship with God, right? You don't pray to her because you think she is God. You pray to her as a model for your own relationship with Christ. And you know, the things that she was able to like stand by the cross with him and John, right? John is there with her. You know, everybody else ran away, according to the Gospels. All the men ran away except John. And somehow she's able to, as the Gospel of John says, she's able to stand by the cross and see the baby. And the medieval devotions are deep into this understanding, right? See the baby that she held in her lap dying. And there's, you know, From Judgment to Passion, I talk a lot about these meditations that they develop in the 12th century of what it was like for her to know him God, but also watch him die.
You briefly mentioned the problem of how does God become incarnate in the flesh. And in your book, you go through a lot of things that I thought were very interesting. You talk about how does it just not tear apart the fabric of reality for God himself, for all of his power to become present in reality. And I mean, I thought we've already brought up Lord of the Rings more already, but this immediately brought me back to our big conversation of who is Tom Bombadil, this character in Lord of the Rings.
He's not Christ.
I wasn't thinking Christ, but it reminded me of, I mean, he seemed like the closest analogy where it's a character that's completely unaffected by the world and seems to have this power over it. And yet, like God, he doesn't use his power for dominion or anything. It's a character that can have all this influence over the world, and yet the world is still fine.
You know, Tom, okay, I did do an episode in Forge of Tolkien on Tom Bombadil. Everybody loves worrying about Tom. There is no Christ figure in any of Tolkien's works, right? Because what he was trying to achieve was a mythology, as he says, that could be accepted by a mind who believes in the Blessed Trinity, right? And I think, you know, as we talked about in the class, that what he's most interested in is this problem of creation, which then he understands for us as artists is this question of subcreation. We make still by the law in which we're made, right? So that image and likeness, one of the image, you know, the image and likeness in which we're made is of a creator, of a maker, right? So like, you know, Melkor gets anxious and wants to make stuff and thinks that the Iluvatar is not taking sufficient attention to the void. Aule gets impatient and wants, you know, creatures that can help him praise the the creation. And so he makes the dwarves, and Iluvatar shows up and says, yeah, I didn't give you that permission. That all of Tolkien's creatures are showing in some way or other that relationship between their being made as from the thoughts of Iluvatar, and in the working of the angels in whatever way, and they're grasping at holding on to their creations, right? Now, where Christ fits in that, it's like, again, we talked, this from the course, that it's each of the different characters, particularly in the Lord of the Rings, shows some aspect of what it is to follow Christ, right? And in that sense, I think Tolkien he's very Catholic, and very attentive to, if you're going to describe God in our relationship with God, no one person is going to be perfect. I mean, so I just claim Mary is the most perfect, but she's not everybody, right? And I did a paper some years ago on Anselm of Canterbury's prayers, which I called Anselm and Praying with the Saints. And I started with this Anselm. Saints have always bored me, or I've always something like that. They made me change it and said I've never understood them, right? And Anselm is one of my favorite authors because his prayers to Mary are so magnificent. But he wrote all these other prayers too, like to John and Peter and John the Baptist and Mary Magdalene. And I'm like, I don't care about those saints. Why would I pray through any other saint? And so I was like, okay, fine. He wrote them. I got to figure out why he wrote all of them. And what I came up with was this sense that we pray through each of the different saints because each one shows us a different relationship with God, right? And I think Tolkien is exploring that with his characters. It's like Gandalf is basically an angel, right? So he has one kind of relationship potentially with his creator. The hobbits have different ones, and Frodo and Bilbo have a different one from, say, Sam, who's the gardener, or from Merry and Pippin, who are the young squires, as it were. Aragorn has his relationship. Elrond, they all do, right? And so they're so you need this full array of characters, because at no point can you capture the fullness of what it is to be able to understand God, right? And so that, I think he's avoiding the problem because he put everything in the sort of pre-Christian moment, right? Until Christ enters into the creation, how do you describe what it's like for indeed the maker of all to enter into the thing he made? It's this problem of reflection, right? And indeed, right, in this life we see, in Paul's phrasing, only through a glass darkly, or only in a mirror darkly, right? Ancient mirrors were apparently they're not as brightly reflective as our mirrors. So you see only in a mirror imperfectly, but that is the only way we can see. And the Eastern tradition, that's one of the interesting differences between the East and the West, that the Western tradition focuses very strongly on that seen through glass darkly, right? All of our understanding is imperfect. The East tends to focus on theosis, right? The becoming, and but it's still in Paul, right? From glory to glory, transform from glory to glory. I forget what the actual phrase is, that you become, in the Eastern understanding, as you live as a Christian, more and more God-like, right? And particularly in the Marian text that I talk about from the 13th century, they intensify that for her, right? They say she becomes Deissima, right? The great, most like God, goddess, right? And they're very Eastern in their explanation there. Protestants will read that and say, oh, they made her a goddess. It's like, well, yeah, that's because they're reading, Pseudo Dionysius. and they have a strong understanding of that transformation that they indeed expect all souls to achieve if they're blessed, right? And, achieve the vision of God. But otherwise, we only see through the reflections of God in the creatures, right? And that's, so Mary, she's the container of the one who made all these things. And so all these things are some part of what she was able to contain, right? So, and so Richard of Saint Laurent in his book on all the creatures goes through from heaven to his heavenly images, earthly images, water images, artifacts, and the choirs of angels and saints, right? And Mary is somehow containing all of those because God, in fact, placed all of them in creation, and she was in her, right? So you're supposed to be doing one of those Escher problems, right?
It's like the hand drawing a hand.
Yes, exactly. Right. Yeah. So like that one, like the Escher hand drawing a hand. But the thing is, God made everything and then entered into the thing he made. And that, again, that's the way Tolkien thinks about it, but it's there in the medieval liturgy constantly.
And you explain how, like with depictions of Mary, sometimes they'll put a diamond on her chest or abdomen to signify the purity of, will signify her purity in containing Christ. And then you also said this in, I believe, in medieval England, that Mary had to be a virgin, not because sex was bad, but because it's a place where the holiest of holies is a place where no man can enter.
It's a sense of the sacred rather than a sense of the pollution of women, right? And in the medieval understanding, right, that I talk about this a bit in From Judgment to Passion. For example, in the 12th century, there's Jews that have come to England, particularly with the Normans, right? They settled them in the towns, and we talked about that a little bit in the medieval England, but it came up more, yeah, because I was showing you the Jewish quarters and stuff, right? So the monks and clerics in England are able to have conversations with Jews, and one of the things that they point out is that the Jews find disgusting this idea that God could enter into the world through the shameful parts of a woman, right? So Odo of Canterbury, I think, has that in his dialogue. And, so that, Christianity insists that that's what God did. Is that she's, magnificently holy, or is it disgusting? So again, like Chesterton would make it say, it's like, well, which one is it, right? if the criticism is like, you've elevated her above all other women, oh, you've done something that God should think gross. Right.
We said we talked about the trees.
Okay.
Well, I wrote down some of just the various titles of Mary, because there's Our Lady of Misery, which I'm the Mother of God, Wisdom, which we've discussed, Truth, Mother of Wisdom, Mother of Truth, Mother of Peace, Cedar of Lebanon, Star of the Sea, which, as you discussed, is the meaning of the word Mary, and then Ark of the Covenant, which you've also mentioned, Tree of Life, and the Inextinguishable Lamp, which I also thought was interesting. Because the Inextinguishable Lamp reminded me of Hanukkah, and then, as we also discussed in Tolkien, it reminded me of the two candelabras or candle holders that are described. And I think it was Exodus, one in the shape of an almond tree and the other an apple tree.
Well remembered. And I did a talk on campus, I can't remember what date it was exactly, for the Lot Hamantash debate. And I was just watching that recently to show to a friend, and realized I did a sort of calc onto the University of Chicago about those candelabra trees, right? The telling of the story. And at one point in the thing, I'm going, it's all in Exodus. Don't you all know this? So the tree imagery, there's a person who just showed up in some of the chats that I'm in, who's from Lebanon, and was showing us pictures of the cedars of Lebanon. You realize these are the trees that are used to build Solomon's temple. They're amazing. These magnificent, and the reason the cedars of Lebanon were so prized, they used them, the Phoenicians used them for ships and such. Right? It's like the ships that sailed the Mediterranean in antiquity. They're very, very tall and very, very straight, right? So I think that that image of, well, in Tolkien, we also talked about the power of that image of trees, right? That clearly people in all sorts of ways were very dependent on trees. And so that, like mountains or rivers, or I guess those are the big ones, right? These natural, the creatures that we have with us in the world will be powerful for us in varieties of ways. And you could make evolutionary arguments about how we lived in the trees and then the snakes ate us. No, wait, I'm a little off topic. The snake and the tree are also always very closely associated too. Snakes live in trees, right? I don't think, I'm going to punt on this one, but because I think none of us can do it very well right now. I don't know how good we are in modernity at describing the power of these sorts of living or real symbols, right?
Mm-hmm.
Things that are real in the world and yet point us to the divine. And I did a course a couple of years ago for the history department as a junior colloquium where we were reading a variety of like comparative religious studies, called it History and Religion. We read things like Joseph Campbell, Mircea Eliade, and things like that. And the thing that we found, I did not pick them for this point, but now I've done it, so I can't do it twice as an accident. I didn't pick them because they were all Catholic, but we realized they actually all were in the end. It's like Campbell grew up as a Catholic. So if you mentioned Jordan Peterson, right? And he's actually calking a lot on Campbell's journey, hero's journey and such. Campbell was a Catholic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And his primary exercise as a Catholic, although he says he's not really anymore, he's Jungian, but he's still Catholic, is showing the reality of these symbols across all traditions. So to your earlier question about Baal and Asherah, and it's like, which is true and which isn't? Well, the Christian answer is, reality is there are these angelic beings and people interact with them, and depending on your understanding of your relationship to our creator, you think of them differently, right? And if you want stuff from them, this I'm cribbing off a podcast called The Lord of Spirits, which Andrew Damick and Stephen DeYoung do. I hope I got those names right off the top of my head. Father Andrew Damick does a Tolkien podcast too, which plays off of some of this stuff, right? So in their Lord of Spirits, they talk about how, polytheism is actually the place that you get to in religion if what you want is to get stuff, right? It's a 19th century image of the development of religions, which in fact is articulated by Andrew Lang. And Andrew Lang is the one who Tolkien did his On Fairy Stories lecture in honor of. So it all comes back in, right? Okay, the reality is, let's just go with we're standing in the beam, looking at the sun and say, the reality is God created us all. And the reality is also that there are other beings. They're the divine council of angels, but also the angels that turned away from their place in that office, in that hierarchy. And those angels somehow are with us, among us on earth, and some of them have accrued worship. And the promise that they make in accruing worship is, you pray to me and I'll give you stuff, right? And there's a sort of direct relationship, but of course they can't because they're lying. But that polytheism from this perspective develops as the demons attract worship. This is what the early Christians said about all the pagan gods, right? That they're actually demons. Stop worshiping them. They're not the true God. They're not the creator who actually made us. And they will deceive you, right? They will make you sacrifice things that you shouldn't, like your children.
They'll bring you gifts.
What?
They'll bring you gifts like Anatar.
Right, but they'll demand they'll demand of you things, but the prizes they give you are always at the cost of your soul. And unless you're able to see that as the reality, the power of things like holy mountains and holy trees and holy temples and holy of holies just isn't going to hit you. Reality of these invisible beings, right? And like we say in the creed, God maker of things visible and invisible. Well, the invisible stuff is the angels and demons. But no, you've wondered why you haven't heard of it. So on the blog, there's a post about angels and demons. I can't remember exactly how it was titled. It's like 2 years ago. Prior Peter Funk and I did a session for Luma Christi on this sort of mythology behind Christianity. And what I did, I'm text heavy on a lot of stuff I do. So I was reading from Dorothy Sayers' play about the building of Canterbury, but also pointing out that the problem in modernity is Rudolf Bultmann, who is the great Protestant theologian of the early 20th century, who insisted that we could demythologize Christianity and still have it make sense. And that for modernity, we needed to demythologize it because it has a worldview that is completely, obsolete, right? But that worldview includes things like the existence of the angels and demons and the reality of heaven and the reality of hell and so forth. So I think the bluntest, this is probably going to be the thing that gets me in most trouble on this video. The bluntest thing to say is modernity is kidding itself that these aren't realities, right? And even within, academic theology, that has been the acceptable position, right? To say, we've transcended this old religion, and we don't need to we don't need to talk about angels and demons and heaven and hell anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But then it kind of raises the questions like, well, then what are we being saved from? I mean, we've come nicely around to the the problem of what you're seeing when you're looking at that beam or not, in the tool shed. What kind of vision of reality do you have if you don't allow for the actual existence of these spirits? Right. And I got to I got to the Lord of Spirits podcast because I was listening to an interview that Father Andrew did with Jonathan Pajot, I've also done videos with him. And Jonathan he has this whole podcast on the symbolic world, and his take on all of these things, a lovely way he talks about symbolism matters, right? It's going to get you. it's real, right? And the patterns are real, and the sort of, it's not just the power of them. It's like he had in his podcast with Father Andrew, he's talking about Santa Claus is real, in the sense that he's a sort of corporate being, right? It's like Santa Claus is all of the parents giving their kids presents, right? And we know these corporate beings actually do have power in the world, because you can see the power in group psychology, right? And the sort of demonic is often seen in these these mass responses. It's like, and you say, oh, these people look like they've gone crazy. Well, in antiquity they would have said, yeah, you've been Ares has driven you all to war, right? And you've gotten the madness, the war madness, and you're all at war. Maybe they're it's like they're describing a psychological reality that we are no longer willing to acknowledge, but that we actually still experience because it's just true.
Well, at the same time, moving kind of into medieval England and politics, has there really been an attempt? Well, there are people that would argue we need to ditch the common law, but America and the United Kingdom are extremely entrenched in the idea of sort of the historical symbolism and the power of precedence as a guiding force in our own politics. And so it kind of raises the question, well, there's such an emphasis on demythologizing religion and kind of moving into looking at the person looking through the beam, and yet what implications does that have for our politics at the same time? If, I mean, every document that we read for hundreds of years was, well, in the time of King Edward the Confessor, and the precedence has always been this, and the traditional rights of Englishmen. So
I did some posts on the blog about January 6th, and it was specifically in the power of the symbolism that was playing out. It didn't even matter what side you were on. It's like this was this incredibly charged symbolic moment of the way the Congress people behaved. I did a post comparing Nancy Pelosi's costuming with the Q shamans costuming, and acknowledging they're both in costume, right? They're both playing character parts, but they're playing them in what. And I also did a post specifically on what the Q shaman did when he went into the Senate chamber, but it was inspired by one of Jonathan Pajot's Facebook posts saying, the world is becoming re-enchanted, whether we like it or not, basically, right? For good and for bad. And it's just, the power of these kinds of symbolic moments or practices, or it's like it's interesting how your language breaks down, because you're saying, well, it's real. It's like, okay, again, bringing back to when I was trying to say, it's like, when I'm trying to learn defense and I have this word for this thing and I haven't ever experienced it, what does it point to? And if I say to you, there are these corporate beings like Santa Claus that manifest themselves in human behavior, as Jonathan has argued, or that, I think, the saints in general are meant to be individual personalities, right? But one of the Protestant objections that I've heard of, is we can't pray to the saints. How could they hear all your prayers, right? And I'm like, well, you don't understand the relationship between heaven and earth. And so I suspect probably with their being present, in the heavenly quiet, in the heavenly court, it's not exactly the same as, hearing one-to-one conversation, but whatever, right? That you are, we started on this thread because we were trying to understand, what's tree, what's a mountain, what's a city, and that, when I was listening to this podcast, I happened to be looking at a screensaver that was playing off on an Apple TV, and it was showing me all these pictures of cities, right? And I hear Jonathan Pajot talking about corporate beings, and I'm looking at cities and going, and that's what in antiquity they'd have a genius, right? And that's it, like Jerusalem, holy, glorious things of you are said of you, O city of God. And in Revelation, the heavenly Jerusalem comes down arrayed like a bride. Like there's a relationship between this collection of buildings and the people who live in it, and this sense that there is a being that is the spiritual being set over this collective existence. And that is, it's like in the ancient gods, that's what they are described as. And, the worship of pagan antiquity was the worship of your city, right? The city power that you have. And you can see that people coming together and either as tribes or as kivas, the kivitate. I can't show off on camera. Forget it. That collective existence has a sense of divinity to it. That's what Yahweh was for Israel, right? Somehow that collective identity is manifest in the spiritual reality.
We've done with the United States. We have Lady Liberty, and the Venetians did it somewhat with La Signoria. So
I don't know that Lady Liberty is ours.
Really?
I think that's an idol. I mean, the statue is, right? What do we worship? Now, we worship the law and we worship the Constitution, and that goes back to what we talked about in medieval England, right? And if you think about that, for Americans, it's really hard because it's like, it's not just it's a piece of paper, and it's like not, and it's the idea of the law that we hold sacred.
Paper. Have you heard? I mean, what's the big stereotype of Americans? It's my rights to do this.
Right, right. And liberty is an aspect of that, but the sort of claim is the law. And there was this very interesting moment when the Q shaman shows up in the Senate chamber, right? And there's an officer of the law following him as he comes in, and they're not doing. There's some guys in there not really doing anything, and shaman goes up to the table and he's gonna like sit down and take a selfie or something, and the officer is saying, "You guys, now come on, this is like the sacredest place." And my ears just went wing, right? It's like, this is not this, like, this is,
that's what all the commentators are saying too. They're like, this is the center of the Republic. It's
the sacredest, they're literally saying it's the Holy of Holies. They're saying that the building of Congress building is our temple.
It struck me as the inverse of the Gaulish sack of Rome, where the capital was the only place where the Roman people were safe when Rome was sacked. And so it was the reason, that's part of the reason the Capitol Hill was so important for the Romans. And then it's irony of ironies. We've imported all this stuff from Roman culture, Roman Latin, from the Roman government, trying to style ourselves as a new Rome. And then 200 years in, our capital is the thing that gets breached because we don't have walls around our capital, just like the Romans didn't have walls around their city. But
and the way you describe that, it's like, it's the breach of the sacred, where are we? And that's what Jonathan has been talking about. It's like this thing, it's like the inversions, right? This everything keeps getting inverted. And Jonathan and I first met each other, got each other on camera together because I've been talking about Milo as this holy fool, and Jonathan says he has this thing about watch for the fools, right? My fool is Milo, or was. Milo is transforming into something else right now. Jonathan's was Kanye West, and that suddenly 2 years ago, Kanye starts doing the gospel music and Jesus is king and stuff. And everybody's going, oh, he's, what is he doing now? This is nonsense. And it's not really real. And it's not authentic. And Jonathan like put him in his lectures and said, this is really interesting, right? You got to watch the inversions, the characters that, ought to be the outsiders, but they become the top because the center is no longer. I mean, I think that when you're describing what happened in the Capitol, right, it's breached when it shouldn't be, right? It should have been the sacredest place, and it's got this crowd rushing into it. The other thing, I mean, so I did a post on, which is called Battery Life, on the Pelosi Q Showman comparison. Then I did one on the sacredest place, right? Because I was so taken with that language. And then another one called Tyrian Purple, which was showing the clothes that the women
I saw you tweeted about this, and I saw.
Yeah, the clothes that the women who were attending the inauguration, Biden's inauguration, were wearing, and it was literally the colors of the Temple Veil, which is kind of accidental, possibly because probably they didn't know that, but it was just interesting the range of purples that they ended up with, right? It sort of matches somewhat the colors that you get from the purple sea creature that you get, the murex, you get the purples out of. And so they're performing this sacrality even as they're apparently attending a political thing, right? No, it's that they are performing the sacred there. And
and the imperial, because
and the imperial
Byzantium purple was wasn't Tyrian purple was the specific imperial color,
right? It was reserved for the in the later Roman Empire, in the Eastern Empire, it was, or I guess it's senators wore it, right? The stripe on their togae was that purple, but the purple was the imperial color. And so famously in the 10th century, when Liutprand of Cremona goes and negotiates with first one emperor and then the other, and the first one likes him, the second one doesn't. And one of the things that he's wanting to bring back to Lombardy and then later Otto the First is purple, right? And whether or not and he mocks the second time he's there, mocking and saying, well, our prostitutes, what do you think so special about yours? So there was that purple color, which is imperial and sacred, right? It's the Temple Veil, but also the regal color. And then Lady Gaga, who was going to sing, did this Instagram post picture of herself in white, standing under the dome of the Capitol, which is painted with the apotheosis of Washington. And I only learned that because of the Dan Brown book, which talks about it, the lost symbol. And I'm like, I'm reading the Dan Brown book, and it's like, what? There's a painting that has the apotheosis of Washington in the Capitol dome, and I thought he made it up. No, because he does his research, and yes, it's really there, right? So we may be closer to Roman and paganism than we think we are, because it's like, so earlier we were talking about the Psalm 2 says the anointed king is the son of God. Mm-hmm. Well, the Romans claim that they are, it's like divine. And here we have this apotheosis of Washington. Now, what's interesting, bringing absolutely everything into massively, wonderfully full circle, is when Father Andrew and Father Stephen are talking about this problem of what's divine in antiquity, and they're saying, well, this I don't know what word they were actually specifically talking about, but the word that I translated it to was manes, the divine manes. I was on a dissertation committee, my very first one when I got here, a student in Rome, in ancient Rome, who was studying the problem of the dead, right, in Roman paganism, whatever you call it. And you have tombstones that are making offerings to the divine manes, right? And he ended up with this whole problem of, well, how do you talk about anything as divine when Jupiter and Rome and the dead are all called divine, right? Mm-hmm. And in the Eastern Christian tradition, there's still more active sense of this complexity of spirits, right? These spirits, right? Whatever they are. Whatever happened in Washington on either January 6th or January 20th was invocation of the sacred. Now, whether it's an invocation of the creator or whether it's an invocation of the Lord of this world, well, you may have different opinions on that, right? I mean, they swore, and the thing is, in the Tyrian purple, I show all the biblical texts that show the danger. It's like there's the holiness of this color, but also the danger of the color, because the whore of Babylon wears it too. That the oaths of office are taken on Bibles, right? So these texts are there, right? You've just sworn on something that you're participating in this symbolism.
Hope we can talk about the Lord of the Rings and the new Amazon show. That what little we know about that.
Nothing. I'm not going to watch it. And if they no, the Amazon show, the Tolkien Facebook groups are all in wailing about it, and my friend Vox Day put something up about it, so his readers all talked about it. So that's basically what I know, which is they probably want to make it secular in the sense, and so therefore it's like you only have two choices, heavenly or earthly. And as we talked about already with Tolkien's understanding of his creation story, he always wants his primary problem in his stories is right worship, right? And that gets to both magic and the other thing you asked about. There was another thing in there, that everything is this problem of, are you praising God as creator, or are you offering worship to other beings who are promising you things like long life and riches and so forth? And typically what tends to happen, and I think so indeed the most disturbing thing that I think is out there in the discussion about the new Tolkien, the Amazon series, is they hired an intimacy coach, consult. What do you need an intimacy coach for?
Well, they're more explicit. They said the actors needed to be comfortable with nudity.
Well, right. And it's like all of Tolkien is about having children. So yes, they have sex, and the characters do, but pornography is a way of blinding you to your sin. So if what Amazon wants to do is make Silmarillion into soft porn like Game of Thrones, they are not going to be in the spirit of Tolkien. We talked about this in the class too. It's like, how do you have his story depends on genealogies. What do genealogies depend on? Having babies, right? So clearly he means his characters to have sex, but he doesn't put it in his narrative. He was perfectly well aware of people in his own time that were writing sex scenes, right?
It's not made into a form of entertainment.
Well, it's a sort of Marquis de Sade, it's appropriate to show whatever physical activities that you're doing, because basically we're all just machines, and then we can this is a family show, right? I won't say it, but do that thing naked and then philosophize, and that you're not bound by any expectations, that you should do it within God's law.
Well, thank you, Professor, for talking to me. This is very interesting. Helped address some of my questions, especially about the Ashera. So I look forward to talking to you in the future.
Well, thank you for having me. Thanks for the conversation.